this is apropos. Saudi Arabia's de facto leader Mohammed bin Salman is to hold talks with the US president next month during a 3-day trip to Washington amid speculation that Riyadh is seeking a security deal after Donald Trump pledged to defend regional neighbour Qatar, and as the Crown Prince pushes on with his ambitious mission to modernise the kingdom and rebrand its image on the international stage, as James Vazina reports.
Riyadh season 2025. The 6th edition of the 6-month-long event opened on the 10th of October with a large-scale parade.
I'm just loving everything that Riyadh season is bringing. As a performer myself, I love to see that the musical Wicked is coming here soon, so that's really cool.
We're here at Boulevard World at the moment. We've had the tennis, we've had comedy festival. There's just so much and always new things coming up, which is really, really exciting.
The mix of cultural shows, concerts and sports events draws some of the biggest names in each field, like the Six Kings Slam, which saw Yannick Sinner beat Carlos Alcaraz to win a $6 million cheque and a golden tennis racket. In the past years, Saudi Arabia successfully carved a place for itself in the world of sports. It's been added to the Formula One racing calendar, founded a lavish golf tournament and hired one of the greatest football players of all time in the name of Cristiano Ronaldo, who plays for local side Al Ahly. But with the impressive headlines and seemingly never-ending cash flow comes a flurry of criticism. When the likes of the US's Kevin Hart and the UK's Jimmy Carr took to the stage for the first Riyadh Comedy Festival, fellow comedians called out the hypocrisy of stars accepting paychecks from a country that restricts free speech and where human rights have been condemned by international organisations.
How do you even promote that? You know, like, from the folks that brought you 9/11.
These events are all part of the Vision 2030 project, in which Saudi Arabia is diversifying its economy ahead of the post-oil future. Spearheaded by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, it's considered by some observers to be a way of distracting from the criticism that it receives for its rights records. MBS, as he's known, was found to have ordered the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul in 2018. Since his rise to power, executions have significantly increased, now averaging 1 a day. In the meantime, his country's become an important diplomatic power broker. In this year alone, it's held meetings between Russia and the United States, hosted a summit for post-war Gaza, and received President Volodymyr Zelensky for discussions involving the Ukraine war.
Well, for more, we're joined now by John Jenkins, former diplomat and ambassador to several countries, most notably Saudi Arabia. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme. As we heard today, John, the Crown Prince is now heading to Washington next month. Let's just start there with a little bit about how significant that visit is. He hasn't been to the US since the murder, as James mentioned there, back in 2018, of the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi.
Yeah, I mean, he was. There'd been a major visit by President Trump in his first term to Riyadh, which was a huge thing before Jamal was murdered. But since then, he's basically confined himself to Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Middle East. I think this is huge. I mean, it's whatever you think of what happened to Jamal, and indeed what happened in the Ritz-Carlton and various other things that happened when the Crown Prince was in his early days of ascendancy. Saudi Arabia is perhaps the single most important country in the Arab Middle East, and Mohammed bin Salman, who is Crown Prince, not king, but he will be king at some point. And unless an act of God intervenes, he will be king for decades. So the question is, can you afford to ignore Saudi Arabia, and can you afford to ignore Mohammed bin Salman? And if you try and deal with Saudi Arabia while ignoring Mohammed bin Salman, will that work? I mean, the answer to that is no, it won't.
And do you expect that Donald Trump is going to be putting him under a lot of pressure here to normalise ties with Israel in return for perhaps some kind of defence deal. Riyadh, it's refused to do so in the absence of the creation of a Palestinian state.
Yeah, I mean, before 7th of October 2023, there were clearly signs that the Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman wanted to adjust its relationship with Israel. Whether that meant full normalization or not, it is a bit unclear. But there was, I mean, there have been discrete contacts on security and intelligence issues between Saudi Arabia and Israel for decades. Bringing that out to the open would have been a huge boost for Israel and for Netanyahu. 7 October 2023 and the Israeli reaction to that clearly derailed it. Do I think normalization is now back on the cards? I think, depending what happens in Gaza, and depending what happens to the issue of Palestinian self-determination, at some point in the future, it will come back onto the agenda, because I think the logic of Vision 2030 is that Saudi Arabia normalizes the relationship not just with Israel, but with Iran, for example, with Qatar, which it has done, and tries to develop a more economically integrated Middle East. I mean, that is clearly has to be the long-term strategic goal. I think it's far too early at the moment for normalization to happen, but I think Mohammed bin Salman will certainly have looked at the deal that Washington gave to Qatar, and will want something similar. You'll recall that when there were those missile attacks on the oil installations in 2018, 2019, and Al-Buqaik and Al-Kharais, which were clearly sponsored by Iran, even if Iran didn't actually carry them out itself. One of the problems it had with the United States was the United States did nothing to defend it. And the deal that the Saudis thought they had with the United States from 1945 onwards was that in return for stabilizing international energy markets, the United States would guarantee Saudi security. Now, it's clearly a new world under Trump. It's not just because of Trump, but Trump is the outward symbol of that. And I think, Mohammed bin Salman now wants something different, something upgraded, something much bigger. Because without stability and without guaranteeing the kingdom's own domestic and external security, it's hard to see how Vision 2030 can achieve all the goals that Mohammed bin Salman has set for it.
Well, let's talk then about how he's been embarking on this mission of liberalising Islam over the past few years. You've said yourself in the past, John, that he's been trying to create a state founded on a national narrative rather than a religious narrative. How successful has that been?
I think it speaks to the aspirations of a huge number of young Saudis. And like every single other country in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is a very young country demographically. It's not as young as Iraq, for example, or Sudan, but the median age is around 30, 31, 32. So it's very distinct. I mean, Europe, we think of Europe as a sort of norm, but Europe is an aging continent. The Middle East is not. And most young Saudis, and I think this was one of the great intuitions that Mohammed bin Salman had at the very beginning, when he became crown prince, want something else. They want fun in their lives. They want freedoms, social freedoms at any rate. They want the opportunity to earn money. They want jobs, and they want to be more like other countries in the region. So what you've seen, I mean, if you go to Riyadh these days, and I was ambassador there until 2015. I was there again in the summer. You go back to Saudi Arabia these days, and it physically and socially, it is a very, very different place. And this is hugely popular with young Saudis. Now, so this involves, we were talking about the comedy festival, bringing Wicked. I mean, bringing Wicked is really interesting because there's still a law against witchcraft on the books in Saudi Arabia. I don't think young Saudis care about that. What they care about is something else, something more secular. Does that mean all the religious conservatives have disappeared? They can't have done. They must be there somewhere, because Saudi Arabia's legitimacy is based fundamentally on its claim to be the claims of the kings to be the custodians of the two holy places, Mecca and Medina, the two great mosques. How do you reconcile that with becoming a more normal state within a regional state system? It's worked so far. I think there are still challenges ahead. It's been remarkable what he's done. He has surfed a wave of popularity. I think in the end, the endurance of that popularity will rely on economic development, economic reform, and economic growth. And that, to me, is the key.
And John, how have these reforms helped to transform perhaps how the rest of the world looks at Saudi Arabia? And is his message getting through to the Muslim world?
Yeah, I think there were always misunderstandings about Saudi Arabia. Some of that because it's very hard to get in. The Saudis didn't do very much to promote their own country. So this idea that Saudi Arabia is behind 9/11, and clearly a lot of the hijackers on 9/11 were Saudis. They weren't all Saudis, or Egyptians, Lebanese, and so forth. And Saudi Arabia had, from the 1960s onwards, it tried to export a very rigorous, purist, and austere and intolerant form of Islam to the rest of the Muslim world. To a certain extent, that was a protective reflex against communism, against Nasserism, against Baathism, and the rest of it. But that became the way in which Saudi Arabia was viewed by everybody. But Saudi Arabia was always a far more complex, interesting, and plural society than people outside thought. And I think you see that being reflected in the way that young people are responding to what Mohammed bin Salman has so far tried to do. One interesting thing is that he has moved. I mean, traditionally, certainly in the Saudi state that his grandfather Abdulaziz built, it was built upon an alliance between the family, the El Saud, the religious establishment, and the tribes. I think one of the great intuitions that he had when he went in from 2015 onwards was that neither the tribes nor the religious scholars mattered in the same way, nor did the key other families, other branches within the family, the Naifs, the Sultans, and so forth. Some of that is a gamble, but I think he's read the mood of young people in the kingdom accurately. But this is a moment. You need to keep moving forward on all of this. So if you look at what's happening with Vision 2030, he has actually changed the way it is being implemented and some of the goals from when it was originally announced. And he's done that in response to circumstances. And particularly the inability to generate large amounts of foreign direct investment, on which Vision 2030 was predicated. Because that's supposed to drive jobs growth. So Saudi Arabia has 20 million Saudis. You need to provide a huge number of important, productive, rewarding, status-filled jobs for Saudis over the next 20 years. That's the real challenge.
And John, just finally then, as the home of Islam, how influential is the kingdom in the wider region? You say it has a unique status.
Massively. It is the heart. I mean, this is where Islam arose. They are the kings of Saudi Arabia. They don't call themselves kings; they call themselves custodians of the two holy places, which was a title originally applied to the Ottoman Sultan. So in a way, it's a sort of quasi-sultanic, quasi-caliphal claim. And what it says is that this is the most important kingdom within Israel. So a Hajj, an annual pilgrimage to Mecca, and its environs every year attracts 2-3 million pilgrims. There are also the minor pilgrimages, which attracts millions more. So every Muslim in the world, if they're able, will make a pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia. It is the heart. And the heart of that is Mecca, and the heart of Mecca is the Kaaba, by the great mosque, the great shrine, the meteoric shrine. When you pray to Mecca as a Muslim. It is absolutely central, which of course is one of the reasons why having a Saudi imprimatur on whatever deal is reached eventually between Israel and the Palestinians is so critical, because without that, other countries won't come in.
Well, John, thanks so much for joining us. Fascinating topic. Unfortunately, we are out of time, though. That is John Jenkins, former diplomat and ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Thanks so much for being with us.